Agent Orange. It's a name that's become synonymous with one of the most controversial chemical warfare programs in history. For millions of people, that name still brings up images of war, of loss, and of a poison that didn't just seep into the soil, but into entire generations. Today, we're going to break down the story of Agent Orange. This right here, this is the image so many of us have in our heads. A helicopter flying low over the jungles of Vietnam, letting out this fine mist. But that wasn't rain. It was a chemical designed to strip the earth completely bare, and it ended up leaving a scar so much deeper and so much longer lasting than anyone could have ever predicted. So what exactly was it? Well, at its core, Agent Orange was a really powerful herbicide, a chemical that kills plants. The U.S. military used it for almost a decade, from 1962 all the way to 1971, as part of this massive program that had the code name Operation Ranch Hand. To really get our heads around this, we're going to break it down into 5 parts. First, we'll look at the chemistry behind the controversy. Then, how it went from a science lab to the battlefield. We'll cover the massive scale of Operation Ranch Hand, the devastating human and environmental costs, and finally, the complicated and painful legacy that we're still dealing with today. So let's just dive right in. Part 1. What exactly is Agent Orange? This is where we get into the chemistry of a huge controversy. On paper, the formula seemed pretty straightforward. It was just a 50-50 mix of 2 pretty common herbicides, 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D. These are chemicals that were already being used in American agriculture and for stuff like clearing plants away from power lines. But here's the kicker. Here is the hidden danger. The process they used to make one of the herbicides, 2,4,5-T, it created this unintentional and incredibly toxic byproduct. It's a dioxin called TCDD. And this little contaminant, this is the real villain of the story. It's the source of all the horrific health problems that came later. So how in the world did an agricultural chemical become a weapon of war? Well, that brings us to part 2, from the lab to the battlefield.
Turns out, the idea wasn't exactly new. Research into using herbicides as weapons actually started way back in World War II. But the real turning point was in the 1950s, when British forces used similar chemicals to deny cover to insurgents during what was called the Malayan emergency. That experience heavily influenced the U.S., and it led directly to President John F. Kennedy giving the green light for Operation Ranch Hand in late 1961.
And that brings us to the operation itself. Part 3, Operation Ranch Hand. The unofficial motto of the pilots who flew these missions was this grim, ironic twist on an old slogan, "Only you can prevent a forest."
The scale of this is just hard to wrap your head around. Nearly 20 million gallons of herbicides were sprayed over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. To give you some perspective, that's enough to fill about 30 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And you can see the footprint of those spray missions right here. They were concentrated between 65 and 71, and they left this permanent mark. All those red areas on the map highlight these huge swaths of South Vietnam that were just doused with these chemicals, over and over again from the air. Let this sink in. Over the course of the whole 9-year operation, more than 20%, a fifth, of South Vietnam's entire forest area was sprayed at least one time. A fifth of the country's forests just gone. So, the big question is why? Why do this? Well, there were 2 main military goals. The first was defoliation, basically strip away the dense jungle to take away cover from enemy guerrillas. And the second was crop destruction, wipe out food supplies to weaken not just enemy soldiers, but also the rural villagers who supported them. But that strategy came at an absolutely unimaginable price. So let's look at the fallout in Part 4, the human and environmental cost of poisoned land. The damage to the environment was so massive, so completely off the charts, that a lot of people felt like it needed a new word. Historians, lawyers, even the Prime Minister of Sweden at the time, started calling it ecocide, the intentional, large-scale destruction of the natural environment. And the cost to human health has been nothing short of catastrophic. Exposure to that dioxin contaminant has been linked to this horrifying list of conditions for both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans. We're talking multiple types of cancer, devastating birth defects like spina bifida, heart disease, diabetes, the list goes on. And look, this wasn't just a theory. The poison physically got inside people's bodies and it stayed there. Back in the 1970s, scientific studies found high levels of that toxic dioxin, TCDD, in the breast milk of South Vietnamese women and in the blood of American military personnel who had served in those sprayed areas. And all of this leads us to the final and still ongoing chapter of this story, Part 5, a contested and painful legacy, the fight for accountability.
You know, one of the biggest arguments to this day is simply about how many people were affected. The estimates from the Vietnamese government are just staggering. Up to 4 million people exposed, with 3 million suffering from illnesses. The Vietnamese Red Cross puts the number of people disabled or sick closer to 1 million. Now, it's really important to note that the U.S. government has called these numbers unreliable, and that just highlights the deep, deep divide that still exists.
And the debate wasn't just about numbers. It was about whether this was even legal. When the UN debated if this violated the Geneva Protocol, the U.S. and its allies argued that herbicides weren't technically chemical weapons. This quote from the United Kingdom in 1969 really captures that official position perfectly, basically saying the evidence just wasn't there to ban anti-planned chemicals in war.
For the American veterans who came home sick, the fight was just getting started. By 1993, nearly 40,000 of them had filed disability claims related to Agent Orange exposure. But look at the number who had actually been compensated. Fewer than 500. It's just a stark picture of their long, hard battle for recognition. And this is not just ancient history. The poison is still there. Today, former U.S. military bases in Vietnam, like the one in Da Nang, are considered dioxin hotspots. The contamination in the soil has been measured at levels up to 350 times higher than what's considered safe, and it's continuing to poison the local food chain and threaten new generations. Which leaves us with a really heavy, unanswered question. It's a question that echoes all the way from the defoliated jungles of Vietnam to the courtrooms and doctors' offices of today. When a weapon destroys the land in order to save the soldier, who ends up paying the price, and for how long?